people often will put me on the spot and say, tell me what this is and what it's worth. And I'm like, it just doesn't work that way. If their piece is not in the catalog recently, that is when, and it's a big name, you run into problems. I see every fire, flood, hurricane, tornado, mudslide in the country. Sometimes I go there. And with that particular piece, there is so much debate in the art world about, is it real, is it not? And I thought, no, because I've looked at it. But then I started reading the research behind the research. Say, like, this is not what you think it is or not what you hope it to be. And here's my research. I had a client recently, millions of dollars in cruise ship art. And he thought he knew everything about it because they had explained it all to him. He had memorized it. He was a very smart man. Like, in his profession, he was incredible. Some of those pieces I appraised for $50. It was horrible. Forgers have gotten better. That is 100% true. But there are some things that are still very difficult to forge. So I sent him the receipt, and he said, I did not make that receipt. And so this man's entire insurance claim was denied. He had put a fake email address that looked very similar to the real email address on the top, so I would email him, you see.
Over again. My name is Daniel Pfalzgraf. I'm owner of WheelHouse Art, and I want to thank you all for joining us today for an appraiser's guide to uncovering the story behind the stories with our special guest, certified art appraiser Christian Trabue. So a little background. The current exhibition, Truth, Lies, and Fairy Tales, is all work based on subjects of like fairy tales and urban legends and things of that nature. And what made me think about putting this together was reading about headlines of fake news and post-truth and dealing with the rise of artificial intelligence, making us kind of question what's real and what's not real. And that made me think about how we've dealt with similar situations throughout history. And fairy tales and urban legends and those things are all tools that we've used, stories that we've shared to either share our truths, things that we believe to be true, or at least things that we want others to believe to be true, whether they're true or not. And so it's kind of like we've always had to kind of like go through and dig into those stories to decide what's real, what's not, what the background of why those stories are what they are, kind of thing. And well, last month I was out for dinner with my family, and we ran into Christian while we were out, and who I've known for many years, being in Louisville art community. And that got me thinking about the work that she does as an art appraiser, where you have to sort of, someone's presenting you with a piece of artwork that they believe, you know, that is worth potentially a lot of money or whatever, and they want you to do an appraisal for it. Christian's job is to kind of cut through all the noise and figure out what's true behind the work to be able to fully appraise the full value of the work or not. And it kind of perfectly aligns with the theme of the story, so I wanted to get her in here for this program. What happens when an artist's existence is largely vanished? What should we consider when we're confronted with never-before-seen work of art by known artists before we accept them into their canon? What happens if the great-grandson of Pablo Picasso's next-door neighbor to their vacation home decides to put this painting up at auction? How much weight do we put into the value of their work, even if there's no record of this piece ever existing before? How do we value that? What can we do to provide proof of a painting is in fact what they say it is, if there is even ever anything with 100% certainty? Or is it more kind of amorphous that falls on the spectrum that shifts over time as new details and experts weigh in on it? This is where the work of art historians, art authenticators, and art appraisers comes in. They dig deep to help us, the rest of us, by decoding information that's available to tell a story about the art and subsequently the artist. And it's because of the amazing work done by professionals and art appraisers such as Christian that it's my privilege to welcome Christian to WheelHouse Art.
Thanks,
Thank you. So just real quick, a little biographical information on Christian. She received a BA in art and art history from Center College, and she completed an appraisal studies program at New York University in 2002. Afterwards, she began her own personal property appraisal business and continued to run that business until she joined the staff at Enservio Select in 2009. She's a regular speaker at historic homes and libraries and occasionally writes for art publications and has appeared as an art appraiser expert on National Public Radio. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard somewhere along the way that you may have even done a little work with Antique Roadshow. Is that true, or?
Sort of. Not really. When I was hired at the company that I work for now many years ago, there was another gentleman interviewing at the same time, and they took us out to dinner, we started chatting, and he was the person who had purchased the rights for the Antiques Roadshow in America after living in Britain. His name was Dan Farrell. And he was a really interesting person, and they ended up hiring him. So I worked with Dan, and once in a while I would help him out with background information and things on the Antiques Roadshow. I think what a lot of people don't know about the Antiques Roadshow is that those appraisers or their companies are paying for them to be there, and they travel throughout the country all on their own dime or and they're not paid in any way. So it's an expensive thing. It's great publicity for them, and they are extremely knowledgeable. But even just this makes me a little bit nervous. So being on camera would be very difficult for me. I would hate that. But working with some of those, I did work with a few of those appraisers, and I loved it. They were very interesting. It was more fun to see them on TV than it would have been to see myself. But no. And I was telling Dan, and part of our thing today was we were talking about this, but I thought it was kind of interesting that when you watch the Antiques Roadshow, which I also love, they just give you the answers, and it seems like they know everything, but they are traveling with a library, I think Dan told me, of 10,000 books. They're also consulting each other constantly, which is what I do in my job, because you can't know everything. You cannot know hundreds of millions of artists that have lived throughout the decades, but you can know how to be the best person, how to research those artists. And of course, some artists come up more than others, and you know who those artists are, but you can't know everything. So those appraisers actually are doing, if they see something and they recognize it to be something good, they're quickly doing a bunch of research and talking to other people before they go on the camera. So that is something people often will put me on the spot and say, tell me what this is and what it's worth. And I'm like, it just doesn't work that way, unfortunately.
Yeah, I hope no one snuck something in their coats to ask her after the program. Can't do that today.
Right.
But is there anything else you wanted to share before we jump in, or?
I think you covered my background pretty well.
Cool. All right, let's get going. So being an art appraiser means having a multidisciplinary skill set. Your job isn't simply to just slap a price tag onto a piece of artwork, but you have to be part art historian, part detective, part market analysis to come to your conclusions. How do these skills play into your line of work?
Yeah, I think when I go to a client's house, or even if I'm just talking to them on the phone, I think part of it is it is a heavily, just like any sort of academic work, it's heavily researched. So, I'm looking at the facts of the piece first. Does the canvas look right to me? If it's a work on canvas, let's say, the size, what's the condition? I'm not a conservator, but I can notice things like peeling paint, or, I use a black light. All of those things play into the value. The things that you would expect, is this type of painting in style right now? Even if I don't necessarily know who the artist is up front, is it the sort of thing people are collecting? So we stay on top of, what people are collecting, because ultimately something can be like the most fabulous piece of art and have very low value. And I do see that sometimes just because it's out of fashion or people aren't into that style right now. So much of art is just like any other commodity, which I hate to say in an art gallery, but it is true that it's only worth what someone's willing to pay. And that's why there is some regional art that does better in certain regions. We have regional artists here that might sell better here than, say, they would in Iowa, because nobody knows who they are, or maybe that's just not, people here aren't necessarily collecting beach paintings all of the time for their house. But in California, when I go to California, which sometimes I do, I see a lot of paintings of the coasts, and those are more valuable there than they would be here. There are some artists that overcome all boundaries. You think of the big names, but there are also some other artists that for some reason might catch on in one area and do better in that area than they do their home area. So you just constantly have to know, that. So it's a lot of research about market trends, about where the artist was at the time when they were working, maybe even like what you hear about Picasso's blue period a lot. So I think people sort of understand that, but maybe what period works best for that artist, what types of art people like of that artist the most. And that's true for contemporary art and for historic art.
Are there any unexpected skills that you've had to pick up being an art appraiser that you didn't even think about before going into studying it or to become one?
Yes. A lot of my work is solitary, but a lot of it is communicating with other people, which is fun sometimes. It's really interesting. You have to understand how to talk to so much of the art world is closed. I will say, I'm not just saying this because I'm here. This gallery has, even when Brenda Deemer owned it, has always been a very open, very accessible gallery. They will always talk to you. They will give you a price. You can walk in and not feel like it's too stuffy. At least I have always felt that way here. A lot of galleries and auction houses are not necessarily like that, and it does put people off. And for appraisers, it keeps us at a distance. They don't always want to give us the information. There are a lot of reasons for that, but so you have to learn how to talk to the galleries. You have to learn how to get the information, make connections, work with, I have friends in appraisal firms all the way across the country who I might call and say, hey, have you ever done a work by this artist? Can you send me some comparables, or can you give me a connection at this gallery that I may not know very well? Those are skills that took a long time for me to pick up, because it's not necessarily the easiest thing in the world to have to constantly try to keep up those types of connections. And technical skills, things like learning how to use a black light. When I first started using a black light, they taught us this at appraisal school. You don't necessarily know what you're looking for. The reason why you use a black light is because you're illuminating the canvas to try to look for, say, old repairs, things that might affect the value. So that's a skill that I had to pick up. Small things like using a jeweler's loupe, which appraisers use to see things closer, 20 times magnification. So yeah, but there's like both technical and social skills that I had to pick up along the way.
Yeah, make your own CSI show.
Right.
Yeah. So a lot of your work is filling in the blanks.
Yes.
So can you walk us through a typical process you follow when evaluating a piece of artwork with limited or no historical documentation of an artist? Like, how do you approach never before seen works by known artists, or how do you appraise work by unknown artists, if that's even a thing?
Oh, it is a thing. If someone asks me to appraise it, my biggest thing is always, some appraisers will say, if you want me to do it, I will, but I can't guarantee that it'll be worth more than the appraisal costs. And sometimes that's the case. I can often look at a piece and just say, I just don't think it's going to be worth more than the appraisal costs. And I might refer them to an auction house. So the auction house, what a lot of people don't know is that if the auction house is interested in selling it for you, you can call them and say, like, will you look at this? I might be interested in selling it. And they'll do that for free and tell you what they think it'll sell for, ultimately giving you sort of an auction, a fair market, what they think a fair market value might be. As far as approaching it myself, it is very difficult. If it is let's pretend like it's a Picasso, like a big name artist, and nobody's ever seen this work before. That actually happened to me. I have appraised a lot of Picassos, all of them well documented. So most important artists, but certainly not all of them, have something called a catalog raisonné, and that is a list of all of the known works by that artist. All of the ones that have been approved, that they've said, these are the ones that this is not all artists. These are the big names mostly, and maybe a few others. But these are the paintings that we know to be of this artist. If their piece is not in the catalog raisonné, that is when, and it's a big name, you run into problems. And I would say to my client, I can appraise this as in the style of that artist, but I cannot say for sure. If it looks right to me, then I will say, I think you should go have this authenticated. Authentication is a very expensive process, and if your piece is worth that much money, it's 100% worth it. But there are different ways to go about authentication. So with an unknown artist, I will first try to decide whether I think it looks good enough to at least even be authenticated by looking at things like the back of the canvas, the things that we know about the artist. Are the colors right? Is the style right? Sometimes you look at a piece and the style, it's in the style of, but you just know there's no way that that artist painted that. If it came to something like a Jackson Pollock, I'm not knowledgeable enough to know the way his splatters hit the paintings, but there are people who are knowledgeable in that way. So, yeah, if it's an unknown artist, then what I do is I will put it in my mind, I'll look at it and say, oh, this is a like 19th century Kentucky tonalist. And here are those Kentucky tonalists. This is what those are selling for similar size. Is it a good painting? Do I think visually it is aesthetically pleasing? Do I think people who collect this type of work would want this? Where would I put it on that scale and prices? And then I have to take into consideration things like size and condition, and then the fact that it is by an unknown artist. And we don't know who it is, but we can attribute it to a certain school or a particular period of time. And that's how I approach. Mm-hmm. That's sort of a very short summary of how I approach value.
And you already kind of touched on this, but so appraisers, you don't just do this as a hobby for fun and just picking out random pieces to appraise, but you are hired by people to do this work.
Right. Yeah.
And so who typically hires appraisers and for what means? And what and why does the work you do differ from the work authenticators do?
Oh, well, just private individuals hire me. They might need an insurance appraisal, or if somebody has passed away, they might need it for estate purposes or donation purposes. I used to do a lot of divorce appraisals, which I really don't do too much anymore. They're too difficult. Once in a while, somebody really needs it, I'll do it, but it's pretty rare that I do those. But those are the reasons. I also appraise for, I do a lot of museums here in the state, but also outside the state. I have a few corporate clients I appraise for. And the company that I work for is is probably the biggest post-loss evaluation firm in the country, meaning we have a division that appraises just what you might have in your house, but then the biggest part of our company is for loss purposes. So if you have a fire, I see every fire, flood, hurricane, tornado, mudslide in the country. Sometimes I go there and we evaluate so that they can collect on their insurance policies. So we put values on everything in their home, and we have different departments. And but yeah, those are the basic reasons for appraising. I can't think of others. Can you?
So I have a question, which is, do you ever help gallery owners help set a price on it?
That is a really good question, and I don't know. I'm sure there are people out there who might. Most of the time, by the time it hits a gallery, if it's a new artist, they may be having a hard time, but that's what the gallery director or the gallery curator is really there for. Sometimes I do have artists call me and ask me to do that for them, but I really won't, because they know their market better than anybody. They know what their pieces have been selling for, and they should be working with a gallery to set those prices, because I'm not. Sometimes I will do art. Some clients ask me to advise them on purchasing art, and I will do that. That is completely separate from my appraisal business. If they really want to buy something and they're not sure if it's like a good piece, or if they want to understand how to start collecting, I'll help them understand what they might like. We'll work on that, but I don't do the values for pieces going into galleries at all.
So you mentioned previously that a lot of your work is done solitary, but that communication is also a big skill that you've had to develop as an art appraiser. So after you've done some solitary work and reemerge, there's a lot more collaboration with other experts that you will work with. So to what extent do you collaborate with others, such as art historians or authenticators, and how does this collaboration enhance the overall understanding of an artwork?
Yes. So if it's if they've had it authenticated and it comes back to us, that's the best. That is the absolute best you can have, because they're saying, authentication, and I guess we're touching on that later, but I might as well. Authentication would be like they are looking at many different elements. So what I told Dan when we first started talking about this is my favorite example is that, do you remember the Leonardo piece that came up for sale a few years ago, the highest selling, the Salvador Mundi, that sold for the highest price ever. I think it was
$450 million.
Yeah.
Originally bought for 10,000.
Right. So the way that worked, and this gives you, it's a combination when people are having something authenticated of experts in the field combined with science, and some people have both areas of specialty. So they're doing things like testing paint, looking at brush strokes, using infrared technology to look under the painting. Then the historians come in and they're looking for examples of, have we ever seen this piece before? If so, where did it show up? And with that particular piece, there is so much debate in the art world about, is it real, is it not? And I thought, no, because I've looked at it. But then I started reading the research behind the research. And it is really incredible what they did. And I honestly believe it probably is by Leonardo, just because of the research that I've seen, which was a very short summary because it was very lengthy. But basically, they were looking at historic records, and Leonardo had made an etching that was in the Royal Collection. And they were able to pull that etching out of the Royal Collection, which meant somebody had to go to the Royal Collection and say, hey, do you have this etching and can we look at it? So they did. It looks very similar to that. Then they found another etching that was just the folds of the fabric of Salvator Mundi, and they matched. And those were definitely by Leonardo because those had long, I guess when Charles had been kicked out off the throne, this, is it a carpenter? I can't remember. A carpenter purchased the painting, but when he was reinstalled, he gave it back. He presented the artwork back to the throne. So then it gets passed. Charles left it to his mistress in his will. And it descended in her family for years, and then they lost it for 200 years. And then it randomly showed up. By the time it showed up 200 years later, it had all kinds of restoration work, basically just overpainting. That's why nobody recognized it. But the owners that had it thought this might be it. So they started having that's when they really started having the technical research done behind it, the infrared technology. And the thing that really got me ultimately was that towards the end of his career, Leonardo was such a master because he wanted the surface of the painting to reflect light in a beautiful way. This is why historians love, often we wonder, like, why is the Mona Lisa so special? And part of it is the lighting. Leonardo was using his hand, and he was pushing his paint with his hand so that when you looked at it like in a raking light, it had this very specific Leonardo pattern, this light and shadow that was extremely subtle to give the skin and things better texture. And they can see his handprints in that Leonardo, in that Salvator Mundi painting. But beyond, so that was sort of like the technical research, and they did test the paint. The paint matched the Mona Lisa specifically. And, artists in that period were not going to Hobby Lobby and buying their paint. They had to learn how to make their own pigments. They were grinding their own pigments. They had to learn how to make binders. All paints need binder. They were making their own binders, and these were sort of secret formulas that the painters used themselves, and they might teach people under them those methods. In fact, they would. So sometimes you'll see paintings by the people working in their studios, and that's why they have the same binders and paints. And then that's why there's some debate sometimes. Like, some people thought maybe this was a student of Leonardo, but I really don't think so, especially after seeing the etching and seeing the handprints in the painting. But that took a lot of, a real conservationist, not just a restorer, but a real conservationist is a scientist, and they usually have to have a chemistry background, and they have to have an art history background. It's a very specific and unusual combination for somebody to have sort of both things, because sometimes they have to take a painting, you've seen paintings with missing paint. Sometimes they have to in-paint. So sometimes I will go into a conservation studio, and honestly, this is when my second career would probably be a conservator, because I find it so interesting and I love watching them work. They're artists, because they will go and look at a painting that's missing paint, and they can in-paint it. And they can make it look like the original, and they're using as close to the original pigments as they can. I mean, they're doing everything they possibly can. And I think I have one more story that might be sort of fun to hear.
Yeah.
I was called down to Texas, and this, I probably shouldn't say the name of the artist, but it was a well-known Texas artist, let's just say. And these people had been renovating their home, and they pulled off drywall, and there was an old plaster wall on it, and it was covered in this beautiful painting. But it was a fresco, which if you ever took an art history class, you know fresco is wet plaster and you paint into it. And it bonds with the plaster and it becomes a permanent part. Unlike a painting which is painted on the surface, you know, fresco is permanently part of that plaster. So they wanted to sell it. They wanted to cut it out of the wall and sell it. And there were 2 art dealers in Texas who wanted it, one of whom used to be an appraiser. And they decided to have it cut out. And you can imagine old plaster. You know, if you even if you hammer into plaster, you know how it crumbles. Well, they got this special company and they paid all this money to cut this painting out because it was very valuable. Then they had it framed. And somewhere in that process, that painting cracked.
Oh, sad.
And they put it up for sale anyway. There's this very high-end, really well-known gallery in Texas that does auctions a couple of times a year that just goes bananas. And people in Texas has a lot of money. People always spend tons of money on these local artists that are well-known. So I had to go down there, and this is, again, one of the hardest parts of my job, and I had to be like, hi, I'm from Kentucky. It's nice to meet you. Will you let me into your gallery and will you show me your price list? So in the process of that, I had to call people I knew might know him. I had to have introductions. And then I went in and talked to the gallery. Actually, I went into the restorer first. And there were 2 of them. And I walked in, I'll just tell you, this is my favorite part of the story. I walked in with my Starbucks. And they looked at me and I said, oh, I'm so sorry. Maybe I should just take this out. And she said, no. She had an Italian accent. Why are you drinking Starbucks here? And she threw it away and she went to the back and made me this big cup of Italian coffee. She said, this is the only thing we allow here. And she brought me 2 Italian chocolates out and said, sit down. And so I was like, okay, it was really good coffee. So we sat down and we talked about this piece. They had been going over this for months. There was a lot of debate, like who actually cracked the painting? Was it the people taking it out of the wall? Was it the framer? Was it the gallery and transportation? Was it nobody knew, but they were, the dealers who had paid all this money for it were mad and they were trying to collect on insurance, but the insurance company didn't know who to subrogate against, meaning they didn't know who to go back on to collect the money. So we were there trying to figure it out. But while I was sitting there, the reason why they had sent it specifically to this conservation house was because one of the 2 conservators, she was the employee of the owner, was Italian. And she had special training in frescoes because during World War II, and off the top of my head, I cannot remember the name of it, but when they were bombing Italy, the churches suddenly said, what are we going to do? They're going to bomb the churches and all of these, 15th and 16th century paintings are going to be gone. We need to get these off the walls. But again, they did not know how to do it. So they had to think of a way to quickly get the paintings off the wall. And I ended up watching videos on this. And if you ever can, whoa, it is really incredible. They took basically, think of a Band-Aid, except it was like this gauzy material and this special kind of glue. And they came up with this last minute. They attached it all to the wall. Okay, huge. You know how big those frescoes are, huge. They attached it to the wall. They had people grabbing it and they would just rip it off the wall and then it would be stuck to this piece of gauze.
Oh my God.
And then they would store it like underground until the war was over. But they saved all of these Italian frescoes that way. So now in Italy, they train in this method. It worked. Like, it was incredible how fast they came up with it, and it worked. So she knew the method. I had never even heard of it. She told me about it. That's the way they should have removed it, but nobody asked her. She knew how to restore the piece. So they were restoring it to the best, and then they put it up for auction, and it still didn't sell. They claimed it was the damage. But anyway, that gives you an idea. Like, so I had to make friends with them. Once I made friends with them, and it wasn't hard, they were extraordinarily friendly. They called the gallery for me and said, look, this is who she is. Can she please come in? They were friends with this gallery because they did all of that gallery's restoration work. So I went in and talked to that gallery. And then that gallery said, I've really got to talk to the framer too, because that's really who they're blaming, is this framer.
No, it's not the framer or the gallery. I'm sure there's people cutting it out, not the gallery or framer.
Right, I know, right? Well, who knows? But we came to a conclusion. But anyway, I needed to talk to the framer. When I went in, the guy who actually framed it said, I did put a lot of stuff in there to try to keep it stable. He needed to actually leave some room so it could move around. He's like, and I don't know if that's what broke it or not, but he was being honest. But so I started talking to the owner of that gallery, and the owner of that gallery was fantastic. And just forgive the political implications here. I'm just telling you this because it's a funny story. But he said to me, we were chatting, and he said something about, oh, I don't know, something about being liberal. And I said, I am shocked in Texas you would even say that to me. You don't know who I am. And he said, you're in the arts. Of course I'm going to say it to you. The story he had told me was that he had framed George Bush's portrait for the White House. They had flown, George Bush called him and had flown him, said, can I, would you frame my portrait for me? I hear you're the best framer. He said, so they flew me out to West Texas on Air Force One, and then I framed it, and then they flew me up to Washington, D.C., and I hung it. And I said, that is incredible. And he said, and I'm not even a Republican. That's what it was. And I said, oh my God, I'm shocked. And he said, well, don't be shocked. You can't tell anybody in Texas, unless they're in the arts, that you're that you're not a Republican. And I was like, oh, okay. I just thought it was a hilarious story. But yeah, that was kind of but that is sort of, you asked me about the skills, and that, I would say overall, I have always been sort of a shy person, and I've had to get over that tremendously to be in this job.
So you have to sort of weigh the credibility of your sources, I would imagine. When someone brings our work for you to appraise, how much weight are you able to put into their claims when assessing their artwork? If someone comes in with a drawing on a napkin that they said Abraham Lincoln did in 1864, and turns out it was someone at Phoenix Hill Tavern did in 1984,
right,
or something. How much do you put in weight to what they say, or how do you determine the stories behind the artwork long after an artist is gone and unable to verify or refute claims?
Right. Okay. We always enter an appraisal as a skeptic. It's easier to prove something is not what that you think it is than it is. If there's no documentation, no provenance, and the chances are it's not. And for evaluation purposes, which is ultimately what I do, it doesn't matter, because you've got to approach it as a collector would approach it. Would a collector want to purchase that napkin if there was no provenance on it, no paperwork, and no authentication? So if I'm going to appraise it in its current state, I'm going to say, this is what they think it is, or, this is what family lore tells them, but I can't prove it. If I can prove it, I will. I'm required to do what they call due diligence, which is research, do as much as possible, but I can't, I'm not an authenticator, so I can only go so far. And if they want me to appraise it anyway, I will, but I have to appraise it for what we know it to be today.
Cool. And I'm sure there's always differences of opinion in appraising artwork, particularly, with big stakes on the line kind of thing. When there's a difference in opinion on authenticity or status or value by different appraisers, how do these conflicts typically get resolved, if they even do get resolved, or what happens when there are valuation disputes for works in the middle of an insurance claim or legal or tax issues?
Yeah, the two places I'd say where it's the biggest debate is probably an insurance claim, and also something like a divorce, where you might, somebody needs it to be worth more and somebody needs it to be worth less. So as an appraiser, it doesn't matter, and this is true for me, it really does not matter to me who the client is. I mean, it does sort of, but it doesn't. We are not supposed to advocate. We're just supposed to look at the piece and say, do our research. This is what it is, and this is where we think it fits in. I'm the review appraiser for my company, so that means I'm looking at everybody else in the art department and looking over their work and fixing it and talking to them about it. So I do see a lot of this. The rule of thumb is you should be within 10% of each other when you're coming up with a value for it to be. And if we're further off, then we have to understand why. I need to understand somebody's reasons. If there is a debate, like if there's an insurance claim, which is mostly what I deal with, if there is a debate, then I will say, okay, here is, you've seen my report and my narrative, but here's my research. And this is where I think it fits in, and this is why I think it fits there. Hopefully the other appraiser on the other side will do the same thing, and then the insurance company will look at it and maybe make the decision. You think that they will always go for themselves, and that is honestly not the case. They're going to go because they have lawyers and things. They will go for the stronger argument. So if I feel very strongly about it, I have changed my mind before. If somebody has found something I didn't necessarily find, I'll change my mind. But they really have to present something important to me for me to change my mind, usually, because I'm pretty thorough.
Yeah, you're just that good.
Yeah. No. No, but I am stubborn.
I imagine, there's a certain kind of dark side behind artwork oftentimes. It's a largely unregulated industry with tens or hundreds of millions of dollars exchanging hands, whose value can be considered subjective oftentimes. Depending on the client, I'm sure there may be tremendous pressure to provide the most beneficial outcome of an appraised value of a work. Have you ever felt that pressure from a client, or have you ever heard of another story of another appraiser who may have kind of fudged the numbers a little bit to increase value of a work?
Yes, yes. And my clients do often put pressure on me, sometimes not even knowingly. They just desperately want it to be something. And that has been probably my biggest learning curve I've been doing this for 20 years. So it's probably my biggest learning curve is just learning how to honestly stand up to people in a nice way and just say, like, this is not what you think it is or not what you hope it to be. And here's my research. Even then, even when you present people with research, sometimes it is so devastating and they're so stuck on that, their mom gave it to them or whatever. And I get it, but you can't, when I see another appraiser doing that, and sometimes you do, and we are ethically, if they are, there are 3 major appraisal organizations in the country, which are the Appraisers Association of America, the ASA, which is the Appraiser Society of America, and the International Society of Appraisers. So they really need to be one of those. You are supposed to state your disinterest in the property. I even have to say things like, I've not appraised this piece within the last 5 years. I've had no association with it. I didn't help them buy or sell it. You really do have to sort of put up that boundary. And when you see another appraiser doing it, the rules of the profession are sort of like this. You don't say, I think the other person is advocating for their client. You say, I feel that value is optimistic. And then you explain your point of view. You always bring it back to yourself, what you've done, what you show. Your research my research should be able to speak for itself. It does come out in ugly ways. Galleries will often give you an appraisal when you purchase a piece from them. Do they have a disinterest in the property? They do not. It benefits them for you to purchase it for $10,000 and for them to immediately hand you an appraisal for $15,000. That is not. I don't think that should be allowed personally, because you just purchased it for $10,000. It's not worth $15,000, but they will. There's we call it cruise ship art. Most people hopefully know now you should never purchase artwork on cruise ships, because you get out to sea, there's absolutely no internet, you can't look anything up, and there have been many lawsuits. A lot of those pieces in the past, let's say especially in the 80s and early 90s, they were selling were fake. Dali's most heavily forged print artist in the world is Salvador Dali. Never buy one. You don't know what you're getting. But yeah, cruise ship art. I mean, I had a client recently, I hate saying this, millions of dollars in cruise ship art. And he thought he knew everything about it because they had explained it all to him. He had memorized it, and he was a very smart man. Like, in his profession, he was incredible. Some of those pieces I appraised for $50. It was horrible. And so, yes, those companies that do that should be out of business. They have been sued. They have been prosecuted. Some of those people have gone to jail, and they've come back out and started doing it again. So know who you're buying from. Like, look them up on the internet before you buy anything. Not from Dan, he's good. But look anybody up on the internet, because, there could be some past, if there are lawsuits against, in fact, there is a very well-known Michigan gallery. This just happened. Did you see this? Oh, so devastating. This woman, her father started the business. They had been in business for like 50 years or something in Michigan. And they were a very well-known gallery, and she was taking Ansel Adams photographs. Her father was one of the first, I think, dealers of Ansel Adams. They were taking Ansel Adams photographs on consignment, and they would sell, and she wasn't telling her clients. And when they would call, She was not there. She made up all of these fake email addresses. Then they said she had had open heart surgery. She hadn't. She had fake employees responding. And, one of these pieces sold for $449,000. She pocketed all the money for herself. They caught her, and the FBI investigated it. She admitted in court she had taken advantage of one people specifically because they were older, and she knew that she could. So, I think when you deal with anybody, you have to know what you're dealing with. Probably the people who have, like, for instance, I don't charge a percentage of what I appraise your piece for. I charge an hourly rate, or you can charge a per piece rate, but no percentage. That makes me an unbiased party, and that's who you want. You want an unbiased party. Yeah.
Let me just ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the floor, if that's all right. So originally, when we planned this program, we were actually going to be, the Speed Museum was going to be hosting it as part of their Stories Retold exhibition. And so we had created all these great prompts of questions based on the collection in that exhibition, which we weren't able to use. But
I got the flu.
Yeah, but there was one that I thought was still interesting I wanted to bring up, and that was the value of sex. And within that show, there was examples of artwork where it was originally attributed to a male artist and then got reattributed to a female artist, or example of portraits of these academics, how they were represented. When it was a female, she was represented with, flowers. Yeah, versus the males who were with their pen and ink and writing things down and yada, yada, yada. So I'm curious how you think the sex of an artist plays into the valuation of a work of art. Is talent and scarcity primary factors determining value, or are we in the art world still slow pulling ourselves out of this sexist history?
Yeah, no, sadly, these statistics are the worst. 75% of all people graduating from art school today are women, but only 46% of all artists in America and Europe are in the galleries being shown today. Of the top, let's see, I'm trying to remember this because I've got it in this piece of paper in case I forget. Of the top 3% of all sales ever, all by men. There are no women in the top 3%. I don't think there are any women in the top 5%. The highest selling painting ever by a woman was Georgia O'Keeffe. And of course, the Mundi, which even if we discounted that, there's a Picasso that sold for 129 million, which is like 5 or 6 times. But even with living female artists, only 19% of all living female artists are in galleries today, even though 75% of people graduating from college with art degrees are women. So in galleries across the country, this has started to change a little bit because so historically we have this is a really complicated issue, and I'll start off by saying a very famous author named Linda Nochlin, which for those of you who went to college in the 70s may remember, wrote a book called Why Are There No Great Female Artists? When I was in college in the 90s, it was one of the only books in the library about women. The other books were on Katie Kollwitz, which I wrote 2 papers on her because I really was, and Mary Cassatt, and I don't think there were any other books at the time. I had to go to UK to get some books on women. But that book basically tried to explore this issue of why there are no great female artists. And really it's because I think we have always approached art as from a historically sort of a Western male perspective. The other important thing to know is that 86% of all artwork in museums today, in the big museums today, are by white men, and then the rest of that is shared by people of color and women. So that is a very sad statistic too, and there are a lot of people trying to change that. This exhibit is great. Like Dan shows a lot of women artists, which I always really appreciate. I mean, look around, it's amazing. But that isn't always the case. So you have people who are the head directors of galleries. It's really important that women can get in those positions of power because they will buy other female artists, but then if they're not selling, they do revert back to the male artists. So it's not just galleries. So we look at the big art shows throughout the world where wealthy people buy a lot of art. So like Art Basel. Okay. So if you look at Art Basel, they put out the statistics every year. Most of the collectors there who actually can afford to purchase things are men. That's because, you look at people who can buy $1 million paintings or even $500,000 paintings, and this is a trickle-down effect in the art world, are the people at the top of the socioeconomic ladder, and those are mostly men in those positions of power, right? They can buy. But at the last Art Basel, not this year, but the one before, we saw that women who were able to afford actually started spending more than there weren't as many of them, but they were spending more than their male counterparts. So we know that if women can get into a position of having the money, they will probably spend more money. Just yesterday, I saw an article come out on LinkedIn that was celebrating the fact that we have closed the wage gap, and now women are earning 84 cents on the dollar as their male counterparts in corporations for doing the same work. I don't think that's something to celebrate, but apparently it is. So in graduate schools, I think the number of people graduating that are women are 65%, and again, that statistic is the same. The 19% of living artists in galleries is just really depressing to me. But things are starting to change a little bit. We have seen in the last few years, of all galleries across the world, 46% of the directors are women, which actually is a very good statistic. Unfortunately, 32% of those galleries, and I believe that's, my numbers may be off, but I think it's 32%, are the low-tier, low-money galleries. The best jobs are being reserved for the men. But in the last few years, a few things have changed. The Tate Modern, which is my favorite museum in the entire world, just put a woman in charge. That was huge. And those women have started networking. There's a New York Times article about it just this year, with each other, supporting each other, and trying to help women out in the organizations. And all of this is to help the women in the arts who actually do deserve the chance to become the great female artist. Historically, the piece Dan is talking about in the museum was just such an incredible story. Dan and I were both like, what? There was an artist, there were three portraits hanging there, right? Mm-hmm. All three of them men. And one of them was probably significantly better than the other two. And they had all been attributed to that man, as Dan said. And then we asked them for the research, like, what did you guys do? But they could, that collection came from Princeton. So they weren't sure of the research that had been done. And we asked them to get us that, but I don't think they ever had the chance. Mm-hmm. But anyway, eventually it had been attributed to this woman, and the painting was better, yet he was the one with the reputation. And that has, for instance, Mary Cassatt was she's one of the only impressionists, female impressionists you've probably heard of. I'm sorry?
Morisot.
Right, Morisot, exactly. There are others, but most people have only heard of that.
Do you remember the exhibition, If You Respect All Paints That Go?
Yes.
That was amazing.
Yes.
That was amazing.
Yes.
They're out there.
But if you ask the general public, and that is a great point, if you ask the general public, like, who are the female impressionists? Most people couldn't give you, a general, but Mary Cassatt was only allowed to, artists like her, they couldn't go into other public spaces. They were mostly painting women, they were mostly painting children. There were only certain subject matters they were actually allowed to paint. And those subject matters at the time were not considered to be the desired subject matters. Those were not the ones that people wanted to collect. And then, of course, you have the lore of, Degas. Degas is, or whoever is the best artist. And this is passed down through generations. We all get I'm not innocent of this. We all have a certain idea of what is good art, and that historically has come from this white male Eurocentric perspective, which we all need to change and work on. And if you start to look at, I regularly now see a lot more people travel today from the United States than they used to. And now I see all of this art from all over the world. And it has dramatically changed my perception of what good art is, because it does not look like necessarily art that comes from here. And then sometimes you come across something and you think, my God, I had an Iranian client a few months ago who had this incredible piece of art. And I said, who is this artist? And he told me this guy had zero internet presence, because of course there weren't there are galleries in Iran, but there weren't, they're not, the websites aren't as good as things. And so I got in touch with the artist and I said, he had a piece probably as big as this wall and it looked like it was on a chalkboard and it was just incredible. And I said, how much is that painting? And he said, $5,000 US dollars. And that was unbelievable to me. But it opened my eyes to like, this is what is happening in other places. There are great artists from different perspectives that don't have so much of a Eurocentric. And I think with that, with the education of Americans and like travel and things, I think that is helping women and minorities and everybody, but it's still not the best situation. So also the other thing that plays into it is the universities you go to. If you look at one of the big complaints about kids coming out of art school is that there are certain universities that they will recruit from for art galleries in New York. And to really make it as an artist, you need to be in art galleries in one of the big cities eventually. To really make it, Yale Art School is huge. How many people can afford to go to Yale Art School? How many people get into Yale Art School? And that is pulling from a specific area of the country as well. Most of those graduates are from the Northeast. We have a very well-known artist that came from Louisville, actually went to high school with Kelty Ferris. If you all saw Kelty Ferris's, yes. Right. They had a retrospective, right, of Kelty's work at the Speed, but Kelty went to Yale for school. Kelty lives in New York now. And that is Kelty's a great artist, but that is really how you make it. It's harder to be from a place like Kentucky if you're not willing to move to New York, if you're not willing to go to one of the big art schools. It happens, it's just not as common. So there's also this discrimination against certain groups of people. In the United States, it costs so much money to go to art school, there's no guarantee you're going to make it. If you're European, the education, well, it used to be free in the 80s, but now it's so much cheaper than it is here. It is incredible. And they also are much more democratic when it comes to, they're not picking and choosing necessarily from the best schools. They are going everywhere for some reason. And you can walk into art galleries anywhere, say in Great Britain, and you see incredible art. And you just think, who is this person? And they might be in, Bath one day and London the next. I mean, it's really, it's a lot more democratic system there. But, they're not doing better with female artists, but they are doing better with diversity and with people being able to actually afford it and have a chance at making a living.
And participate.
Yeah, and to participate, right.
Yeah. All right, well, I'm going to shut up, but open it up the floor if anyone has questions.
You've touched on it a couple of times in your talk. I've developed a morbid interest about art forgery and how they do it and the techniques involved and its penetration into the art world. Mm-hmm. One of the things I've read is that probably a significant number of authenticated art sitting in some of the best museums in the country is forgeries. Mm. What do you think about that?
Well, there is some of that. Yes. And I know what you're talking about. There's actually one guy who is on TV in Britain who loves to preach about how he's never been wrong and how he walks into an art gallery and immediately knows what the fakes are, what the real ones are. And that is not possible. I think if they suspect something, the forgers have gotten better. That is 100% true. But there are some things that are still very difficult to forge. When I'm looking at an artwork, I look at the back. So I look at the stretcher bars. In America, during a certain period, we liked pine. In Great Britain, they used oak. In Italy, they used poplar. Are the stretcher bars right? Are there markings? Are there old tags like the Christie's tags? A lot of people don't know. If you find old Christie's tag in Christie started keeping records of their auction tags in the 19th century. You can go do research and you can find out, where has this piece come from? Frames can be replaced. Stretcher bars can be replaced. Backs of canvas, has it been relined, to stabilize it? Even that can be faked. Age can be faked. Age is harder to fake. Things that cannot be faked are using the right pigments and the right binders, and they can even fake underpainting, but there comes a point where if you're doing enough authentication, it's very difficult to fake. It's easier to prove a piece is not what you think it is than it is to prove a piece is what you think it is. That being said, there have been some great forgeries that people never even questioned. And there is a museum right now that's getting ready to go under because of, the buffets they showed that were all fake. But he did not have those pieces authenticated. He didn't think he needed to. He needed to. So, I think there are a lot of fakes in the market for sure. There are certain areas of fakes that we know are worse than others. Print market, unfortunately, but there are fake paint. If you look at expensive paintings, but not extremely expensive paintings, those people are not going to spend their time faking those. I mean, really, those for the most part are not going to be fakes. It's when you get to big names that, yes, there are some fakes out there. I do not think it's quite as bad as some of these articles would have you believe, but it does happen. And there are some really good forgers. If you've ever watched those documentaries, they're the best. I love those documentaries about it.
Yeah, it's true. It's like you said, it's like the CSI of art.
It is. It's really, I agree with you. I love it. What was your question?
What would help an appraiser to figure out how much is worth something? And for example, I'm an artist, I'm creating pieces, right? What would be good for me to achieve in order to help that process? Like, what are you looking for when you're looking for somebody new? Internet presence, being part of exhibitions, winning awards.
That's a good question. I like that question because I think you look to the market. So you say, okay, what matters, what doesn't. So exhibitions do matter. Big exhibitions matter. So whenever I see an exhibition for an artist, say I'm appraising their work, there was a big Du Buffet exhibition a few years ago when I was appraising one, and they were the monumental works, which are generally hard to sell. Big works are hard to sell because not a lot of people can put those in their space. But there had been this renewed interest in Du Buffet because of that exhibition, and we saw the prices go up for a few years. So yes, that can play into value. What else plays into value? Where it fits into their genre of work. Even with the most famous artists, sometimes the most aesthetically pleasing, we hate talking about this, but sometimes the paintings that may not even be as interesting but are just more aesthetically pleasing might sell better because ultimately people are buying work for their houses, right? Interesting pieces do sell too, but sometimes the more aesthetically pleasing pieces sell better.
So as long as it doesn't end up in a thrift store.
Right.
It's a scene.
Provenance is important. If somebody important has owned that piece, if it came out of the royal collection.
Oh, you mean being collected by?
It depends on who it been collected by.
Correct, yes.
If you do have that provenance, that line of successive history that has never been broken, that will be, you put two pieces that are exactly the same, almost the same next to each other, but if one of them has an unbroken provenance, collectors will go more towards that one because they feel more secure.
I see, yeah. That's investment.
Yeah, what else? I mean, there are so many things. Maybe where it has been exhibited could be important. What people have said about it in the past, where it fits in their genre of work. That could be really important for a piece of art. Yeah.
How much is the role of like social media and digital collection now, like artist self-promotion maybe plays a role in this also, and like actual provenance of the work. Like, if I have my Instagram profile and it has every piece I've ever done on there and shows me making it and all that stuff, and I was in a little group show here and I made a little show there, does that count as provenance, or is that just a way to lead people to research?
No, that would count as provenance. If you've said like I've showed it here, like if I see that, I will put that and say like, oh, this work was shown here. Now, whether that actually makes a collector want to buy it, maybe it will. Once in a while, well, depending on where it's shown, there are some big place of galleries that if they had shown that artist's work and say it was a group exhibition, but they had chosen this piece, yeah, that might play into a person who's collecting that specific. I will also look at, this is something I didn't even think about talking about, but sometimes I'll get a piece and somebody's claiming a lot of money for it and there's just not a lot of documentation. But one of the touch points I can get, if they have an Instagram page, I might say they have 200 Instagram followers and nobody ever comments on their work. That is important because if they are a well-collected artist and people want their work very badly, there's one artist that I follow, I would love to own a piece of her work, but literally within seconds of her posting a new piece, it's gone. That's how you know. Like you're like, oh, if they're self-selling, some artists self-sell. not at the super highest end usually. Once they reach a certain threshold, a gallery is carrying their work. That gives their work a cachet. I think all artists would rather self-sell. It does not help their reputation. It's unfortunate, but, a lot of collectors will think, why isn't a gallery carrying that work? Or they may not feel comfortable going directly to the artist, or they may feel like there's too much competition. A lot of it is a game. Like certain dealers will hold back work for their best clients, not even tell you that they have those pieces. So yes, social media is really important today, and it actually assists me in my work in a lot of ways you might not ever expect. I'll tell you this really fast. I had a piece a few weeks ago, and I literally suspected nothing. It was an insurance claim, and he told me that he had these pieces commissioned for $10,000 a piece, and he had the receipts, and they were good receipts. And I had no reason, except he did not have photos. They had all burned up in the fire, and he never had taken photos of them. So I thought, fine, I'll go to the artist, and I'll talk to the artist. I emailed the artist with the email that was on the receipt, and I never got a response. So I went to the artist's Instagram page, and I emailed, because I'm persistent, the artist that way, and he said, I have no idea who that client is. And I said, wait. I thought it was a little weird because what he was making was landscapes, and what this guy had described to me that he had was not anything close to what this man made, but you never know. So it just didn't occur to me. So I sent him the receipt, and he said, I did not make that receipt. And so this man's entire insurance claim was denied. He had put a fake email address that looked very similar to the real email address on the top, so I would email him. You see. Yeah. So but when I went to Instagram, I was actually emailing with the artist. So a number of years ago, before social media, that may not have been possible. I mean, before the Instagrams and the TikToks, that may not have been possible for me. It would have been much harder for me to call the artist. They're harder to, artists aren't sending by their phones. They're in their studios or whatever. So, you're an artist. Yeah. But yeah, social media is huge.
Do you think people buy work off social media without looking at it first?
I do.
Lose a little screen.
I don't buy expensive. Yeah, some people do. I mean, especially if it's from like a gallery they've purchased from before, or they have an art advisor. A lot of people who are purchasing expensive work have art advisors, which is not a bad thing if you're purchasing a lot of expensive work, or if they've purchased directly from the artist before.
Gives you an idea what you can expect.
Yeah. That is a treacherous part of my job, though, is I see so much art I like. I went into this house with somebody, and I saw this painting I liked so much, and I found the artist, and I tracked him down, and I said, would you make a painting for me? But it has to be small because I can't afford a big one. And he said, I'll paint it for you, and if you don't like it, then you can just not take it. So I was like, sold. And he did that, and I bought it because, who's not going to buy it after that? But it was great. Like, I loved it. I don't see any problem with that, really, unless they're suspicious, or, if it's super expensive, don't go see it in person. Always go see it in person. And once you reach a certain threshold too, you have to know who owns that artwork. There are fractional ownerships now with expensive artwork, and then they sell it, and they find out that one of the owners has not agreed to that sale, or it's not the price, and there's a big lawsuit because now they've paid the gallery half the money. So always know who you're buying from. If you're really buying expensive art, know who you're buying from. Go see it in person. Make sure you know the provenance and who owns it. I don't know if any of you have art advisors, but I would never let a client buy a piece where I did not know who the owners were, even if it was like the piece they wanted so badly. I would advise against it, just because until you have that in writing, until you know everybody's in agreement, it's just, and they generally, just like you would with a house, they put it in escrow, and that's what you want.
All right. Well, Christian, thank you so much for
No,
sharing
thank you.
your stories and your time. Appreciate it.